Welcome to our weekly Zoom news conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, we're focused on a brutal spike in attacks on Asian and Pacific Island Americans, particularly elders, that comes amidst an epidemic of anti-Asian violence. We're also focused on efforts across all communities to combat this. Just this morning, members of the Congressional Tri-Caucus, Hispanic, Black, Asian American, and Pacific Islander held a press conference to express their united response to the violence. We're honored to be joined on today's briefing by John C. Yang, President and CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Marc Morial, President and CEO of the National Urban League. Manjusha Kulkarni, Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, who will jointly present with Cynthia Choi, Co-Director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, and Jose Roberto Hernandez with the Koreatown Immigrant Workers Association in Los Angeles. We will send extended bios and contact information together with a video of the conference to all participants this afternoon and follow-up video excerpts produced by Manuel Ortiz on Monday. We ask reporters to enter questions in the chat box. After each speaker, our moderator will select questions. We will have a final round of questions if time permits at the end of the speakers. Our thanks to our interpreters, Oscar Arteta and Jackie No, for providing simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean, and to our conference coordinators, Pilar Marrero, Sunita Sarabji, Tanu Henry, and Anthony Advincula. A special thanks to Michelle Boykins of Asian Americans Advancing Justice for your help in coordinating today's conference. Today, I'm turning the conference over to our moderator, Pilar Marrero. Thank you, Pilar.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, and to all my colleagues who are here to cover. Thank you. Let's move on. And the first speaker is John C. Jang, President and CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Go ahead, Mr. Yang.
Thank you, Pilar. And thank you, everyone, for covering this and participating in the briefing today. Thank you definitely to Sandy and Sunita and Pilar for organizing this and to have this moment to talk about this important issue. And it comes at an incredibly important time for the Asian American community. I know that I have spoken to many of you about this issue before, and unfortunately, it has not gone away. The issue is real, and it continues to be a source of grave concern for our community. I know that Manju and Sin from Stop AAPI Hate will provide details and analysis of what they're seeing and what the types of incidents that we're looking at involve, and providing some analysis on that. I'm going to provide a little bit of perspective on the national environment, some root causes and conditions, and some potentially national responses that we can offer in this moment. And then we also have speakers like Marc Morial from National Urban League to talk about what this means for the African American community, and Jose Hernandez to talk about what this means for the Hispanic community. So look, for over a year now, Asian Americans have been fighting two viruses. One is the COVID-19 virus that all of us face, and the health effects, the economic effects of that virus. But unfortunately, Asian Americans have also had to fight a second virus, a virus of racism, a virus that is affecting us in a disparate way. And this is added on the fact that for many Asian Americans, they are also frontline workers, working at grocery stores, working in hospitals, working in community centers, working in custodial services. So the effect on our community is definitely very significant. And this is shown in statistics. From a recent Harris poll, over 75% of Asian Americans felt that they were the target or had increased fear of discrimination. An earlier poll done last year said that 40% of Asian Americans either experienced discrimination or heard someone blame Asia or China for COVID-19. So this is real. And the causes of this we've talked about before, but we should talk about this again. And what I have said before resonates right now, which is that words matter. We cannot discount that we had a full year in which we had a president and some of his colleagues called this virus the China virus, the Wuhan flu, and even worse derivations of that. We saw that in September and October at his political rallies, where he would mockingly refer to these terms and had the audience cheer and jeer. So let's be clear. I mean, hate is not new for the Asian American community, and we have seen a history of this as well. Whether we want to talk about the so-called Yellow Peril back in the late 1800s that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, whether we want to talk about the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans, I emphasize Americans, as a result of so-called divided loyalties in World War II, whether we want to talk about post 9/11 and the targeting of Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian Americans because of the so-called war on terror. We have oftentimes been seen as foreigners, we have oftentimes been seen as carriers of disease, and the rhetoric from this past year has not helped. So certainly there is a conditioning that has happened over this past year that caused people to fear Asian Americans. But that's the second cause that we also need to recognize, this root cause of fear. And this fear is the fear of COVID-19, the health fears, as well as an economic fear that people have. When people have fear, they look for a place to blame. And this conditioning is something that we need to be aware of, that this need to blame, and in this case, place that blame on the Asian American community. And look, given the video that we have seen over the past few weeks, we recognize that there is an increased level of attack. We have recognized that this has caused fear in the community. But let's also be clear about this. There's no role in any of this for anti-Blackness. There's no role for this in trying to think about over-criminalizing the process. Rather, this fear that we have, this virus of racism, is a virus that is very contagious and that affects all of our communities, the African-American community, the Latinx community, the Native American community. And we need to fight that virus together. And that's the aspect that I want to make sure that all of us, whether we are reporters, whether we are community officials, whether we are government officials, that we want to make clear is that in order to defeat this virus, we also need to disinfect it together. Now, I want to talk briefly also about sort of what we can do at a so-called national level and what we're seeing there. I know many of you have reported on the January 26th executive memorandum by the Biden administration. As for many of us, we think that that is a good start. What that means in this current predicament is that this could lead to a better gathering of data, a better understanding of the Asian American community and the incidents and the hate that we're facing. But let me be clear about that. That is only a first start as well. There's more that government can do. And the government needs to make investment in communities, whether it is to promote victim response centers, to provide financial resources and financial assistance to victims, whether it is to encourage cross-community, cross-cultural conversations. It's important to breaking down some of these barriers that we've been talking about. And the last thing I would say is that everyone has a part to play here. It is for all of us to lift up this issue. And I thank all of you journalists for lifting up this issue. It is for witnesses to report these incidents to stop AAPI hate or stand against hatred. It is for people to take bystander intervention training so we know what we can do safely in these moments where we see these acts of hate. And it is to set up community dialogues at a very local level, one-on-one level, to break down these barriers of racism. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but all of us are capable of being these agents to disinfect this virus of racism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. We're going to move to the second speaker and then take questions. There's already several good questions in the chat because of scheduling issues. Okay, so bear with me. We're going to go straight to Mr. Marc Morial, President and CEO of the National Urban League. Mr. Morial.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. Let me express my appreciation to John Yang and all of our colleagues and friends and allies in this important effort to eradicate hate, bigotry, and racism from American life. I come today to stand strongly and squarely with our colleagues and friends in the Asian American community to say hate anywhere is hate everywhere, and that hate is an indivisible disease. We stand with and against the efforts to demonize people in the Asian American community, to point the finger and assign some type of sick blame for what we are all encountering with respect to this health emergency, the coronavirus challenge. And I want to just say that it has been distressing for us in the African American community to see that hatred and bigotry that's led to violence has increased when it comes to Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, LGBTQ Americans, Jewish Americans, Islamic Americans, and Black Americans over the last 4 years because of this climate of intolerance which has been created in this nation. So today, I want to make it clear that we will stand together in urging investments in community, accountability for those that carry out these acts, and to continue our commitment to cross-cultural work and understanding, which is essential to the work of civil rights in the 21st century. So we are honored and proud to stand with you in this time of great challenge. And we will say, we will not bend our knee to fear. And as leaders, we must demonstrate a willingness to quickly stand up, to appropriately condemn, but also to try to encourage greater work and greater understanding in this changing America. So John, thank you for including me today, and to all, we stand together against hate.
Thank you, Mr. Morial. There's a number of questions in the chat, and I will take a question that seems relevant to both of you. How is there a way to make people accountable for public hate speech? Mr. Morial, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think there's always been a line between free speech and hate speech. What I believe is that when we see hate speech, we must condemn it. We must call it out. We must confront it in no uncertain terms. But when hatred leads to violence, when hate speech incites acts of violence, then free speech protections go away. Then what you're doing is inciting violence by what you say, by how you stereotype, and how you condemn. So we need to never hesitate to call out and condemn hate speech. And we also need to make it very clear that hate speech that leads to violent acts against innocent people is illegal, it's inappropriate, and should be, if you will, punishable by the law and by our judicial system. But the most important thing we have to do as leaders is condemn these actions, condemn these words. We must do it in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, on Sunday through Saturday. We have to continue to do it because we have to fight, if you will, hatred with messages of tolerance, understanding, and, if you will, love for humankind.
Also, to both of you, and Mr. Yang, you can comment and jump in if you want. I hear that both of you and all of those people in the call are calling for a commitment to cross-cultural work on this issue, but there's a tendency to silo groups like Latinos, Asians, African Americans. How do we do less of that and more of this? Either of you or both of you.
Go ahead, John.
Sure, let me start. And maybe let me follow up just briefly on what Marc said with respect to hate speech. One thing I would emphasize is that just because certain speech might be legal, that doesn't make it right. And
Amen.
we need to make that distinction and to call out even speech that might be considered legal and say, hey, that's not right. On this piece, this is why it's important for all of us to come together, and I appreciate Marc being here, I appreciate Jose being here, is there is this tendency by certain groups to want to silo us, to pit us against each other. Because here, again, racism is the common enemy. It's not that for us talking about this in this particular moment is anti-Asian racism. But let's face it, if we're looking at 2020, we're looking at racism across all boundaries, especially in the Black community. They felt it much worse in many, many segments as well. So we have to grapple with that this history, this virus, as I keep on saying, together, and not let other people, and I do emphasize other people here, try to divide us and make this into an us versus them situation, because that's what they're going to want to do to keep all of the communities of color in check.
Any more comments? No?
All I'll say is John said it well. I say I second it and I amen it.
All right, all right. Okay, there's a question here that's interesting by Adonis Tagala, and I'll let him ask the question. Adonis? Adonis Tagala on the line? Okay, so I'm going to read the question. In the case of Noel Quintana, Filipino-American who was attacked inside a New Year's subway, his face was slashed by an unknown suspect. Prior to the attack, there was no racial comments coming from the suspect, so this case is not treated as a hate crime. Many Filipino-American community members do believe that it is. So how do we navigate this story when the case is not even considered a hate crime, but just a regular crime? And I can assume this has happened in every community too. Mr. Morial, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'll respond to it this way. I was one of the first legislators in the country in 1992 as a member of the Louisiana legislature to introduce a hate crimes bill in the Louisiana legislature. And I remember at the time that some of the most vigorous critics of the bill were prosecutors, people whose responsibility it was to, if you will, enforce the law. While the bill did not pass in 1992, it eventually passed many, many years later after I left from the legislature. And what I do believe is that at the local level, many law enforcement agencies do not understand, do not analyze, and for some reason are reluctant to utilize the provisions of hate crime statutes or cities' hate crimes ordinances to punish individuals for these sorts of actions. Here's where community advocacy and community leadership is so essential. Communities have to raise the question, call the question with public officials, have to call them out, have to put pressure on them, have to encourage them. This democratic system is a dynamic system if it works correctly. And that means we have a responsibility and a right to bring our concerns and to say this should be prosecuted as a hate crime. So I would encourage the community, and I think we will all stand with them to continue to advocate for the full utilization of hate crimes statutes and ordinances, which allow for, enhanced penalties in many instances. So this is not easy. This is not simple. There's still opposition to the idea of hate crimes, even within quarters of law enforcement and prosecutorial offices in the United States.
Mr. Jang?
I think one of the things, and I know that we're actually in touch with this victim, is to also think about just what the proper response is to help the victim. I don't want us to get too hung up, with all due respect, on whether this is a hate crime, whether this is a crime. How do we sort of punish people? But I want to focus it more on the victim to ensure that he or she is getting the resources that they need in this moment. And certainly there should be consequences for action. I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't be, but I think we sometimes get ourselves wrapped up in a web that is not helpful to all of our communities by thinking about it only in terms of criminal manners. Frankly, that is sometimes a way in which wedges are drawn in our communities, to use criminal statutes to create these silos, to create this notion of us versus them. So I want to be very careful. I understand victims' families feel the need for justice. Completely understand that. But I also want us to be smart in how we obtain that justice.
Here's an intriguing question from Yoon Lee. Yoon, you want to ask both your questions? The one about the cities and the one about the target? Yoon Lee? Okay, we're having trouble with that.
He's not on the call.
Oh, he's not. He is. He's posting.
He submitted the question.
Okay, he's posting the. Okay, he's okay. He's just direct messaging me the questions. Okay, he had two questions. One is, why is this kind of crime happening in a diverse city like New York and LA or San Francisco? That's an intriguing question, right? And the other one is, why does this hate crime target elderly women and men? Either of you.
People,
Actually,
go ahead, John.
go ahead, Marc. That's fine.
I was just going to say, I will just tell you that when I've seen some of these videos of senior citizens and older people get victimized, my blood boils to a level I can't even explain. The idea of taking advantage of people who don't have the ability to defend themselves physically is just so reprehensible to me. It's so outrageous to me. I see, when I saw that, I saw my own mother, I saw my own aunt, and I wanted to literally jump through the television and respond to what we had seen. There's just no way to justify it or explain it. There's no way to rationalize it. It is an act of cowardice. It is an act of hate. And I think John's right. Maybe, and I think clearly we have to pay more attention to the victims, to those who've been affected by this. But there's got to be a consequence for some of this. This is not two teenagers getting into a scuffle on a corner. This is someone who can be very seriously injured and hurt, and taking advantage of people who do not have the ability to defend themselves because they're senior citizens, or they may have some physical limitations, is just the worst in the world. And I just, feel when I see it, a sense of rage that reminds me why we have to speak out, and why we have to be energized, and why we have to do everything we can.
I actually will I will defer the question more to Manju and Sin, because both of them are in LA and San Francisco, so they directly know sort of what their community is feeling. Certainly, I think one of the people in the chat said that the elderly are vulnerable. I think that's part of it. And certainly part of it is the economic insecurity that all of us, economic inequality that all of us have been talking about. But let me defer to them, because they are certainly much more educated on that than I am.
And with that segue, we thank you both, and Mr. Morial, Mr. Yang. I think Mr. Morial has to leave, so thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Have
All
a
right.
powerful weekend. We stand together. Thanks, Pilar. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
John.
you.
Pleasure.
All right. Okay, and so now we move on to the following presentation, which is a joint presentation by Manjusha Kulkarni, Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, and Cynthia Choi, Co-Director of Chinese for Affirmative Action and co-creator of the Stop AAPI Hate Center. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Pilar, and thank you to Ethnic Media Services, and a special thanks to Sunita Saurabji. It's just been wonderful having relationships with Sandy and Sunita because they've done such fantastic reporting over the years and making sure that our ethnic communities are well informed. I also want to say that it's a real honor to join my colleague, Cynthia Choi, as well as John and Marc and JR or Jose. So really pleased to be with you today. Next slide. So what we've seen over the past year is really an emergence of COVID-19 related racism in the United States. Some of that is something our communities have experienced in significant numbers really in the last couple of weeks. We wanted to share these examples with you because we believe that they're emblematic of some of the trends and patterns that we've seen across the United States. So I'm not going to read them, but just wanted to highlight, starting at the top left, a refusal of service by a ride hailing company. In the middle, an incident involving elderly parents. The one on the right of impacting an essential worker, a physician in our community. The one on the bottom left is of a middle school child. This was one of the first ones we dealt with here in Los Angeles at AppCon, and really unfortunate that it happened within a schoolyard and took place before there was even a single confirmed case of COVID-19 in Southern California. The one you'll see in the middle actually got some press attention. It was a tech executive in the Bay Area who not only made derogatory comments, but actually weaponized the president himself, saying that Trump is going to F you to a family just celebrating a birthday. And then finally, the one on the right, which is of a physical assault perpetrated by a white man against an individual while making comments. Next slide, please. So as we began to see these happen, we launched Stop AAPI Hate in March of last year, and that is Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, Chinese for Affirmative Action, and San Francisco State University. Our three organizations, having worked in AAPI communities over the last 100 years combined, really have grassroots connections. We also are able to conduct outreach to limited English proficient communities and immigrant communities. And that's why we thought it was so important to have our form available in a dozen Asian languages, and you see them listed there. So people who may not be able to do so in English can do that in a language they're more comfortable with. Next slide. And so what we have seen in terms of patterns and trends is something we wanted to cover today. What we have received over a 9-month period at Stop AAPI Hate is over 2,800 incident reports over the course of 41 weeks. And I want to emphasize the next point, which is that the vast majority, excuse me, are hate incidents and not hate crimes. So we know that in the last several days, a number of the ones that have come to the public's attention are those that involve crimes potentially. But as John indicated, really hate incidents are what our community members are experiencing day in and day out. Those that have been reported to us are from 47 states in the District of Columbia. And we know that many of the incidents take place in those areas or states where there are significant populations of Asian Americans. So it's no surprise that they've taken place in California and in New York State, but that does not mean that any area of the United States is immune. In fact, we've gotten reports from rural areas as well as urban, from far-flung states as Alaska and Hawaii, as much as in the heartland of America. We know that those who are vulnerable are being targeted. And I know that was one of the questions we had earlier. Women are experiencing hate at about 2.5 times the rate of men. This, I think, follows patterns we know and understand from the Me Too movement. And about 7% of respondents are seniors. So we know that they too are being attacked. As one person posited in the chat, yes, we think it's because these folks are seen as vulnerable, and that perhaps the perpetrators think that they might not be able to defend themselves, at least physically, that they might be targeted. Next slide. So I just want to share with you some of our data, and this specifically, you'll see in gray the US numbers or percentages, and then in black the ones that are specific to California, which is of course the state with the highest numbers. So you'll see again, very significant proportion are verbal harassment or name calling, followed by shunning and avoidance. Physical assault make up just under 10%, but I do want to say that again, most of these are not necessarily those that might be prosecuted, because they involve pushing, shoving, throwing of bottles or cans. So while of course we do believe that they're very serious, where there's not significant injury, district attorney may not be bringing these cases. I know there was a question about along those lines as well. We also think there are about 10% that involves civil rights discrimination. So that includes workplace discrimination, as well as refusal of service, being barred from establishments, from transportation or transit, and vandalism. Next slide. When we look at the site of the incident, so about 40%, excuse me, take place at private businesses. So that's of course a concern, because we know that we need to go to our grocery stores, our pharmacies, even our big box retail during a pandemic to really take care of our basic needs. So it's concerning that these happen at businesses, and certainly also happen during shelter in place. We know that about 30% happen in the public arena, so public streets, sidewalks, public parks, public transit, and then you'll see too about 10% or so, at least in California, are taking place sort of in private residences. You'll see that the school number is relatively low here. That's likely due to the fact that most of our schools across the country have been closed, but we do expect potentially a spike in that number or an increase once schools open up. And then finally, the last slide I will share with you, next slide, please, and I'll turn it over to Cynthia, is the targeted ethnicities. So we have here that about 40% are individuals who identify as Chinese Americans. So they make up a plurality, but not majority of those who've reported to our site. That's followed by Korean, those who identify either broadly as Asian or multiracial, and then also Filipino, Vietnamese, and then Japanese. So this gives you an idea, very similar to what we saw after 9/11, that perpetrators are not necessarily up on their geography or understanding of race, but of course, that makes no difference whatsoever. We don't want anyone in any of our communities to be targeted. And so we collect this data to better understand this problem. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cynthia, and we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you, Manju. So again, my name is Cynthia Choi. I'm the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action. And we're a community-based organization based here in San Francisco, but we work on statewide as well as national issues of significance. So as our data shows, thousands of Asian Americans have been subjected to hate, and the impact has been traumatizing. As it's been said, research shows that in addition to the mental health challenges of the pandemic, there's been alarming rates of depression and anxiety related to COVID-related bias. And recent, events of elders being attacked, killed, whether they're racially motivated or not, continues to create a climate of fear and anxiety. And this is all on top of the fact that Asian Americans are the essential workers, are on the front line and feeling the disparate impact, including high unemployment, the impacts on Asian-owned businesses. All of that is well documented. And of course, we have to take into account anti-immigrant policies leading to and post-COVID or during COVID that has created a hostile climate for many immigrant communities and communities of color, not just Asians. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important that we recognize why this is happening. So there is historical precedent of anti-Asian bias and discrimination. As it was shared earlier, we have to understand that that has defined our experience, being denied basic human rights, subjected to mob violence and discriminatory treatment via our systems of laws. At different times, we have been painted as a public health threat, disease-carrying filthy foreigners, as economic threats, as taking away jobs, and at times a national security threat, disloyal to this country that we call home. And we can say unequivocally through our data and analysis that the anti-Asian, anti-China rhetoric and overall anti-immigrant climate, scapegoating, blaming, is directly responsible for the unprecedented levels of interpersonal attacks that we're seeing. Next slide. We also have to recognize the effects of political rhetoric. As I mentioned previously, if you look at any period in our history, politicians have always used divisive tactics to scapegoat and create fear, especially during these times in crisis. And when you had the former president and other senior officials using racist rhetoric, it's not only deeply offensive, it's led to discriminatory policies and emboldened individuals to discriminate and to verbally and physically attack neighbors, classmates, coworkers, and strangers on the street. While Trump is no longer in office, this racist rhetoric and harmful policies targeting immigrants are having a lasting impact as we continue to receive reports on our site and incidents that we're learning about in the media. Next slide, please. So what are we doing in response? Stop AAPI Hate has a four-pronged approach. Obviously, we're most known for documenting and tracking firsthand accounts and our analysis, but we're doing so much more, including providing resources for those who are most impacted and working with our community allies and partners within California and across the country, providing individual and organizational assistance wherever we can. And of course, it's very important that we continue to do the advocacy at the local and state and national levels. Advocacy in terms of policies, but also in terms of taking this issue seriously and creating responses that will actually address the underlying causes of hate. And then next slide. So moving forward, we will very much continue to do the work that we have been doing to provide a little bit more detail that includes legal assistance. We are facilitating anti-bias training, partnering with government agencies, which again emphasizes that government does have a role. We are supporting and conducting community mediation, as well as advocating for policy changes that, again, do not overly rely on our criminal justice system or hate crimes because of what we heard earlier in the panel in terms of limitations around that. And in fact, many of our cases are not hate crimes, what's the work that we need to invest in today? And that includes community-based safety initiatives that Manju and I are both leading in our local areas that we can also talk more about. And of course, we do want to encourage people to continue to report, to share information. We have resources on our site. We need to continue to have individuals share what's happening so that we can continue to take this matter very seriously and create the responses that are really going to make a difference. And then our final slide is just to thank you. We appreciate ethnic media for all the coverage that you do, the stories, the in-depth, nuanced coverage that you do every day, which is making a difference to make sure, in particular, our LEP communities get accurate information. We are fighting a tide of misinformation and lies, if I can be frank about that. And Manju and I are also very happy to take questions after the press conference as well.
Wonderful. Okay, so because we have so many questions in the chat, and I'm getting questions in the phone, et cetera, I am going to go to the last speaker, Jose Roberto Hernandez from the Koreatown Immigrant Workers Association, Alliance. That was my mistake. It's not association, it's alliance. Sorry, Jose. Perdón. Perdóname. So please go ahead, and then for anyone that can stay on, we have questions for you. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this, press conference forum conversation. Okay, so and I thank all the folks that presented, prior to my participation in this morning. So, and I agree with many of the things that were said in this sense, that what we're experiencing right now, it is still the aftershocks of the political and social context that we have been living since the United States was founded. Okay, the United States was founded as a country not based on equality, but based on inequality to a certain group since the inception of this country. So, and let's discuss what that has created, over the past 20 years. So when we saw Barack Obama getting elected, we experience a surge of extremism, of groups of extreme right being multiplied, and they were growing at an alarmist rate. Once we saw the political campaign that Donald Trump and the Republicans were staging in the past cycle that we just finished, that was really scary, because the context of that was that immigrants were bad, that they were rapists, that they were drug dealers, and it targeted a very important sector in society, which is Latino or Latinx immigrants. But we know that racism is a moving target, and it's a moving ball all the time, and it's just a matter of time until it starts getting to everybody. And that's what we're experiencing now with the excuse of the COVID-19 virus. So what we are actually experiencing is the virus of the America First virus. That is the one virus that we need to start dismantling from here on, because that was embedded into society. So when we look at individual attacks, it's just a sign that the whole society, it is getting into a progressive, frantic targeting of minorities and people that do not look white. And let's for just a second understand what's happening in the United States right now. When we looked at the demographic makeup of the United States as of 2019, we looked at the white population, it's about 60.1% of the entire population. And that by the year 2030, probably it is going to be at about 50% or less than 50%. That's what we're experiencing. beyond the individual attacks that are very important, and we have to persecute, and we have to prevent, and we have to do anything possible to hold people accountable, whether they committed the crime or whether they're condoning, or whether they're not saying anything about, improving these relationships in our society right now. The fact is that the white population of this country is at its lowest in history of the United States. And when we start breaking down, we look at the 5.9% of the population in the United States is Asian or Asian Pacific. We have 18% Hispanic or Latino or Latinx. We have 13.4 Blacks. And when we start looking into all the other different minorities, we get to 40%. This is no longer just a minority problem. It is a perception of the 60% that want to exert power over the rest of the population that does not look like what they want. And this is the problem that we're experiencing. So I can talk a little bit about, KIWA's mission. And our mission as an organization is of integration. It is multicultural, but it's about creating power for minorities, creating power for Latinos and Asians at the same time, creating power in the workplace, creating power in society. Because unless we create that power of equality, it doesn't matter that by 2030, we're going to be probably minority. We still are going to be governed and ruled and observed in the world as a white nation. So I think that, we can get into details as to what KIWA is doing right now in terms of defending the rights of workers in the restaurant industry and the retail in Koreatown, which has the connotations of a geographical, organizing for power, and also ethnic organizing for power, right? But we have to look beyond and start creating a strategy that we start talking about what is the United States and the world going to be saying by the year 2030, when the white population and the minority population, right, is going to be as equal, and there are no longer minorities as far as racial makeup in this country. That's what we have to start talking about. How do we build the power to start electing more leaders that represent the different groups in the United States? How do we start, creating a cultural evolution that the world and ourselves will learn to look at ourselves not just as a white nation with minorities, which is still, what we are experiencing today, right? But as a nation of a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and with social justice. And that's what I want to really put to this group today, that we have to start undoing the damage that Donald Trump and all the cronies and the political allies and the selective media that was promoting all this, make America great again. We know what that means. It means that white males should rule this country, and anything else that is not that, then it's a minority, it's a danger, it's a strange, we create sickness, we're rapists, we're drug dealers. And that is the reality of what we're experiencing today. So again, I think that we have to look into alliances, right? Minorities live integrated, the Latino are living with the Chinese are living with the Koreans are living with Vietnamese and Southeast Asians, and now whites in the big cities. So that is a reality that we have. So we have to find a way to start a new cultural evolution that will reflect the reality of this country, that is no longer up to the 60% white population in this country. And in the middle, yes.
Hold on, sorry for interrupting you. We need to ask a question to Mr. Yang, who has to leave.
Okay.
Can you stay for questions after this, just for a few minutes?
Yes. So let me just close by that, just saying that, we need to start working in a long-term plan. We need to make sure that we hold people accountable, that we're promoting, leadership within our communities, and that we have to start changing the narrative. United States is about to become a multicultural and multi-ethnic country. And in the sense that the 75 million voters understand that, I think that then we're going to start, dealing with this problem.
Thank you. Oni, do you want to ask your question for Mr. Yang?
And apparently you're on mute right now.
Apparently nobody can unmute today. Can you help Oni unmute, Jessica, Sandy? Okay, we don't have time to waste here. So, okay, here's a question for you, Mr. Yang.
Pilar?
There we go.
Sorry.
Okay,
thank you. Well, I really appreciate this, that we're coming together as communities to address this issue. I think it's really, really important. But if we struggle to label these incidents as hate crimes, I hope we don't relegate the severity of them to secondary importance because, as Asian Americans, we are too sensitive or not to hurt another community, which has also been suffering from systemic racism. I wonder if that's also affecting the Asian American community to have clear resources or information so they feel protected. If pushing my 85-year-old uncle is considered only a hate incident because he, by any luck, he did not die and walked away unscathed, but psychologically and emotionally shaken, doesn't it make it more difficult for our community to address this issue?
Mr. Yang.
I appreciate the question. And let's also be clear. When you push someone onto a sidewalk intentionally, that can be considered a crime, right? Now, we could get into a debate about, the lawyer in me tends to be careful here, right? Is if there's no one, that person that did the pushing didn't say anything, didn't do anything else except just come up and push. Like some of these videos that we've seen, we only have video, we don't have sound. Then under the law, there is nothing to suggest that it is necessarily race motivated, right? And so again, that doesn't diminish the severity of the incident. And we need to investigate, we need to make sure that that 84-year-old is taken care of, no question. And we need to have our voices heard to make sure that that person is protected, right? But then in terms of the accountability piece, I do think that that is trickier, right? And I don't think that we are minimizing our 84-year-old elders by saying that this person should not be charged with crime. We need to look at that a little bit more carefully, because there, the reality is we know that law enforcement uses criminal statutes in a disparate way against other communities of color. That's just a reality, right? And we cannot allow the law enforcement system to use that same bias against other communities of color in that way. And I know that's hard. I know that is hard for some in our community to hear. And that's why we need to have these community conversations. That's why I so much appreciate the work that Sin and Manju are doing in having those real on the ground world dialogues. But I think that is part of the answers, that we just need to dig a little bit deeper into what is actually going on rather than trying to too quick. And I apologize for saying too quickly, because I don't mean to minimize it again, but sort of resorting to criminal statutes or sort of punitive measures to resolve the situation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yang. I know if you have to step out, thank you so much for being with us today, as usual. Okay. A question for Cynthia or Manju. Do you have a breakdown of the race of the perpetrators? Do we have that? Do we know who is doing these crimes or these incidents?
Yeah, I can take that. We actually don't collect data on the person that has caused the harm. And there's very good reasons for that. One is it doesn't matter what the race of the person is, and we don't want to contribute towards racial profiling. It doesn't help us in terms of addressing or developing responses to hate and discrimination. That being said, we do have respondents describe to us what has happened to them, what is said to them. And in some cases, they provide a description of the person who's caused harm.
And I have a question for Jose. Jose, you work with Latinos and Asians, particularly Koreans and others in Koreatown.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that relationship and the prejudices that we have about each other?
Yeah, so not only that, I think that we are in the middle of Los Angeles' highest density of population. So when we look at the breakdown of the population, it is counted, it's about 120,000 people in Koreatown. It's just 3 square miles, the highest density after Manhattan. And then reported is 25% Korean, 52% Latino, and then there's other, ethnicities of, different backgrounds. So we have a bulk of industry there, about 600 restaurants and 2,000 retailers in that 3 square miles. So we not only look at the problem from the racial perspective, but also from income inequality, access to healthcare, fair housing, and transportation. And when we see that the overwhelming majority of the workers in the industry of the restaurant and retailers are with exactly the same conditions, give or take, certain things, right? But we can see that whether you're a Korean worker, whether you are Latino or Latinx worker or any other ethnicity, you are exploited as well as anybody else. And that is where we have the overarching positive approach to integration of leadership, integration of a mission to make sure that we are, improving working conditions for the industries that we are trying to represent in the jurisdiction where we're trying to represent. And that is also a reflection of 360 degrees. So the makeup of the staff at KIWA, it is half Korean, half Latino, and we have some other minorities, but we're probably 95% minority staff. So from that perspective, everybody's bilingual. So we have the ability to connect with all the different populations, ethnicities, background, country of origin, gender, and we are respectful of all different, ways of life, right? And that's our approach. So from there, the integration starts with the staff. So we are constantly getting trained. We're constantly, monitoring that. And that's how we approach, the community. Mm-hmm. So we are recruiting also leaders that reflect the community. And we do our meetings, in Korean, Spanish, and English. So we have all that accessibility for everybody for equal right of participation.
Thank you, Jose. So let's see. All right, we might want to take 5 more minutes or so, maybe a little bit more, because we have many questions. If you are kind enough to stay around, there's a question about, and I'll ask of the 3 of you that are left in the call. Do you foresee any more attacks, any more anti-China, anti-Asian hate because of US-China relations, for example? Cynthia, Manju, or Jose?
So I can take this question. I mean, I don't know that it would be specifically because of anything related to foreign policy. What we know at Stop AAPI Hate is that there's been a very direct connection between the actions and words of the former president and administration. And so there's going to need to be a lot of work to undo what President Trump has said. As I pointed out in my own presentation, so many of the incident reports we get actually use the former president's language of Wuhan virus, Kung flu, China plague. And we know that there were a number of policies the former administration put forth to really alienate, isolate, and prevent our communities from getting the support they needed through public charge and others. So I think, when we look at long-term solutions, someone mentioned the Biden memorandum in their questions. I think it's really important for us to see that there is a 180-degree shift from the memorandum in terms of condemning the language used by the former president. and that now there's a direction for Department of Justice to work directly with communities. And that's so important because it really is at the grassroots. I know Cynthia has been working very closely with those individuals in the Bay Area. And so that's, I think, what we want to see moving forward to really address these problems.
Yeah, and from our side also, I think it is important that we hold people accountable that are committing these crimes, and that we also hold the politicians that are kind of like, endorsing this type of behavior around the country, right? We have to work into prevention, and we have to continue working into escalation of this type of incidents at this point. It's no coincidence that, we started, giving financial aid to vulnerable families in the community. We have a food bank, but also in December, we had an incident when a Molotov bomb was thrown in front of our office and it did not explode. We were just lucky that that didn't happen, right? So we reported that to the police, and we're all, could become victims of this type of, crimes and incidents at any moment. So we have to be sure that we're, prosecuting and that we are holding people accountable to this type of acts. But most important, it is our long-term vision. How is it that we're going to get rid of this, right? What is our vision to 10 years from now when, our populations will increase, and that's what I'm more concerned. And that's why I talk about, a cultural evolution in this country that is, promoting equality, social justice, but also prevention. And we cannot allow this to escalate, and that's where the word has to be put out.
And there's a couple of questions about, I'm sorry, Cynthia, how to prevent this? There's a couple of questions from the media here. How do we prevent this from happening? How do we address this?
Well, I can start, and others I think can chime in. I think this is the work that we actually need to invest in. There's been an emphasis on hate crimes and law enforcement and reporting and so forth. And we certainly do need accountability. There are lots of challenges around the limitations of hate crimes in terms of burden of proof and such and so forth. All of that doesn't get to the underlying causes of racial bias and discrimination in this country. And so that's why it's important to resource community-based organizations who could lead those efforts through education, starting in our public schools, as well as the conversations and dialogues that we need to have within our community. And let's face it, we have to address bias and the racial hierarchy and colorization within our own community, including class differences. Before we can actually really have authentic dialogues across communities. And I actually think that that work can happen simultaneously, even in some cases, especially for groups who have been working on these issues for decades now. This is actual work that needs to happen. Our communities, no community is immune to bias. And so it's really important, again, to resource the public education and community-based efforts on that.
Anyone else want to chime in? Oh, go ahead, Cynthia, keep going if you want.
Well, I just saw Sunita's question about the mandatory reporting, basically the FBI. I mean, it's true, the FBI relies on local law enforcement sharing their data, but there's a whole problem with that entire system. One is which our community members have a distrust of government and law enforcement. So there's going to be an ongoing challenge of underreporting. And we even maintain that for Stop API Hate, as well as, and it's already been shared, that there is a problem with even being able to identify hate incidents and crimes. So there would need to be a lot of different things to address, data collection and things of that nature. Okay,
thank you very much. Sandy, I think you might want to close or ask the question yourself?
Fine.
No pun intended.
I wish the hour hadn't come to the end because this is such an important exchange and we so appreciate people, our speakers and our media. I guess the last question I would like to ask Sin, Manju, and Jose is basically what most of our media have been asking. Is there a way to address inter-ethnic violent acts which do not involve directly a white versus people of color dynamic? Is there's a sense that if it's Asian versus another ethnic group, it somehow doesn't qualify as a hate crime and therefore those communities aren't protected. This is a complicated question, but I've gotten 2 emails on the phone and I want to be responsive to the media on the call. It's something that Jose is raising as we become increasingly diverse, as we become a multiracial society. The work of inter-ethnic relations is so important, and yet we seem to prioritize white centrality in the racial relations picture. But increasingly in cities like LA, San Francisco, New York, elsewhere, inter-ethnic relations are critical. How do our communities get along? How do we address these acts of violence? So long question, but maybe each of you could perhaps comment.
Very simple. The answer that I have is very simple. Equal power.
Okay.
Right? That's it. You know,
brilliant.
if you do something to me and I don't have the power to fight back, if you have power over me, if you are the boss and you're over exploiting me, and just like me, everybody else that works with me, if you are, you know, elected and I don't have a chance to have somebody that represents me at the political level, if you are, you know, not of equal, right, to somebody else, what we need to work on is establishing the checks and balances of society that grants equal power to everybody, whether it's at home, at the workplace, in the community, at church, anywhere else. We need to have equal power.
Thank you, Sin
And
and
George,
Manju.
Sin, do you want to go ahead and then I'll take it in? Well, what I wanted to just say is, you know, unfortunately, Sandy, what we see too often is that our communities are pitted against each other. And in fact, that is how white supremacy works, right? So that we don't necessarily look at the overarching causes of the problem, but we say, oh, you know what, who's nearest to us, who's in closest proximity, either geographically or socioeconomically. And what I wanted to just remind folks of is rather than accept the premise that, you know, that we're against one another. And I think too many people in our AAPI communities accept wholesale the model minority myth and accept, unfortunately, anti-Blackness. I think we need to look back at actually the civil rights movement. And had it not been for Black leaders after the civil rights movement, after the victories of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, they said, you know what, no more to racial barriers in immigration. They didn't have to say that. They didn't have to do that, but they did. And because of what they did, many of us, including my own family, is in the United States. So we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to those civil rights leaders, because again, without them, we wouldn't be there. So let's think about that and think about how we work together towards solutions rather than accept the premises of white supremacy, which is that let's pit these groups against each other. We have so much in common, and that we can work together for the right restorative and transformative justice solutions. I think that's really what people are looking for, is this time of healing rather than division.
Thank you. And Sin, you get the last word. I know you're also very engaged in developing cross-ethnic.
Yeah. Well, I do want to echo Manju and Jose that, there are no quick fixes. And I said before, no community is immune to bias. And that is intentional, right? It's part of structural racism. And it works and it thrives today because divisiveness is effective. But I'd like to actually talk about the local work that we're doing, because to me, that's the future. And at the local level this past weekend, in response to the recent attacks against our elderly, we came together as a community to really make 3 things known. One is that we need to do better in terms of supportive services to victims or for victims and their families. Obviously, we need accountability, but we need to look at it in a way that doesn't contribute to more violence and more incarceration. We need to look at other means that are healing. Our criminal justice system today, from our experience working with survivors, is they have no self-agency. They don't get to participate in a way that's empowering. In fact, it's designed to be more traumatizing and disempowering. And so we're looking at everything from supportive services to what is going to prevent these incidents from occurring in the first place. And that's the work where I feel is the most inspiring. As I said before, there's a tremendous amount of pain and hurt across all communities, and COVID has exposed that disparate impact. The surge in violence has created an atmosphere of tremendous fear. And so we really have to speak to that and really hold our community at this time, and address that immediate harm. And one of the things that we're seeing are community members from all walks of life saying, what can I do? And that work is very important. And it's coming from not just the Asian community. Our actions this past weekend was multiracial, multi-generational, and this is the work that we need to do. Anytime anyone is a target, any group, any community, we need to stand together.
Thank you so much for all of you for today's conversation. It was moving and enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.